Hello, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for another exciting show of Answers That Count. I'm your host, Charles Musgrove, and we've got another great show. So you know all of our shows are great. You know where to check us out. We are on all your podcast channels, all those favorite platforms that you like. So check us out there. Download us on Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, all the others that you like. We're also on YouTube. And we're also at answersthatcount.com. So feel free to check us out there. We've got some articles that I think you'll find interesting on the Answers That Count website. Look on the articles page there. We've got a lot of current topical information. Some of the stuff we've talked about on our podcast. So you'll see really just a good selection there to choose from. So we are welcoming back in the house Professor Joe Calhoun. Thank you for joining us again, Professor.
Thank you. It's great to be here. This is one of the highlights of my week, Charles. So I always enjoy our time together.
Wow, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. And today, we were talking before we started recording. Today is September the 18th. I almost said August the 18th, but man, this month is flying by. So
yeah, it's moving fast.
Yeah, I don't think there is any monumental economic news out today. No big jobs report or anything like that. So I don't think
no nothing substantial. I mean, there's always some economic news, but there's no big government report or anything that we need to give special attention to today.
Yeah, I did hear before we started the show, it sounded like New York was still pushing back on some of the openings of either schools or some of the businesses. So we saw that they opened the restaurants this week. I believe they opened it to 25% capacity. Is that what you heard?
That's what I heard. Yes.
So it's interesting. I saw some of the restaurant owners and business owners talking about this on social media, that what that does to businesses when you really restrict their capacity to 25%. There's just not a business model out there that can survive with a 25% operating or revenue capacity when they have a much greater cost than that. So it's going to be interesting to see how long states or cities or counties can really hold back the reopening of their business. I mean, we're starting to see some of the legal rulings come out in favor of the businesses that on opening, that there's really not a constitutional basis for keeping these businesses closed. So that'll be interesting to see what happens and how long those governments can resist businesses from reopening.
Yeah, the economics and the simple math usually don't align very well. If you're going to have 25% of your revenue, but maybe incur 75% of your costs to try to capture that 25% revenue, it doesn't take a math major to figure out that's not going to work for you. And it's really putting these businesses into a pinch when you're allowing a little bit of the door to be open, but not the full door. They're just not made for that. Like you said, their business models are not constructed in that way. They might be able to manage through under 75% capacity, but 20 or 50% just doesn't work for many of these businesses. Maybe a few, but generally not.
Yeah, it doesn't. And I believe it was this time last week on Friday is when the state of Florida, Governor DeSantis made the announcement that bars and lounges could reopen, but those are limited to 50% capacity as well. So for a bar and restaurant, that's going to be very difficult. And I think they still have in place the social distancing restrictions in the bars and lounges. So it's that's going to make it very difficult. And I talked to a couple of bar and lounge owners this past week after that announcement was made, and they're still not reopening. It's just too much of a restriction to open and feel like they'll be profitable with that. So it's a difficult model when they're limiting the opening like that to 25, 50%. Like you said, I think 75%. If you get 75% capacity that you're able to do that, then you're getting close to kind of a break-even proposition. But in those type of businesses, it is just almost impossible to make a profitable go at it unless you're at 100% capacity. So we'll see what happens. I think it'll be interesting what happens as more businesses start to really push back on this. And you see when they do push back and they and they challenge and they have a legal challenge with the government, that most of the time they're winning and they're allowed to reopen. I mean, we've seen this in several states and communities across the U.S. in the past month or so.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating dynamic to see it play out. And, our hearts are really with those business owners right now. I mean, their livelihood, their business is literally at stake, and we certainly don't want to extend their pain. But it's a difficult trade-off because we know that if large groups of people gather together, they're likely to spread the virus. So it's a very difficult societal choice right now to figure out where on that balance are we going to land. Are we going to lean more towards the safety and stopping the spread, or are we going to lean more on the businesses and allowing them to open? That's a really difficult question to answer.
Yeah, it really is, and it's hard to keep politics out of this. I mean, you've seen the politicians really weigh into this, and you've seen it from all extremes. You've seen where it's a really an infringement upon our civil liberties. You've heard people say that we're going to look back on this and say this has been one of the greatest infringement on our civil liberties that in our history. So time will tell, and it would be nice to look at this outside the prism of any political influence, but I just don't know that we're going to be able to get that. So.
Yeah, I don't think you can, because the politicians are the one who make the rules. So by definition, this is going to be a political issue because government is deciding these kinds of things, and you have politicians. So by its very nature, it's a political decision.
Right. And we'll talk about politics, the intersection of politics and economics. This kind of really dovetails into our discussion for today. We've got economic theory number 8 and number 9, and both of those, they deal with production of goods. They deal with people earning money and providing value to the economical society, to society that we live in. So, there's many times that policies, they intersect with what is sound economics and really what we should be doing as a society to provide value to those that use products and services.
Yes, and we need to remember that government sets the boundaries, and then we all operate within those boundaries. And if those boundaries are very restrictive, then we're going to have less freedom. And if those boundaries are relatively wide, then we're going to have greater choice for ourselves. So government does have a great deal of, I don't want to say control, but influence over the way you and I conduct our daily business, because we have to operate under the laws that they pass.
Very good. And before we dive into this, I'm going to give a quick shout out to your book. It's you're the co-author of this. This is the 3rd edition, Common Sense Economics. And the other authors on this book are James D. Gwartney, Richard L. Stroop, Dwight R. Lee, and Tawny Ferrarini. And you kind of teased the 4th edition of this will be coming out soon. So we'll keep an eye out on that, and we'll talk about the additions to that in future shows. So that's been a very good book, and we are talking about the 12 key economic theories that's in the first section of this book. So it's been some very good information that we've talked about, and we've made this very topical, and that we've applied it to the current economic and political season and environment that we're in. So even applied it to to the COVID lockdowns and the COVID reaction and fallout that we've all been living through in 2020. Boy, 2020 is something else. I've heard people say this is the longest decade that they've lived through in this past year. So it certainly seems like it.
Yeah, I mean, September is flying by, but at the same time, this year seems to be moving very slowly. I know we're all anxious to turn the page. I don't know how much better things are going to be in January, but I think just turning the page to a new year is going to make us feel a little bit better.
Yeah, exactly. I heard somebody say the other day that they didn't want to roll their clock back another hour because they just didn't want to extend 2020 by one more hour.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So, Joe, why don't you get us started with theory number 8? People earn income by providing others with things they value.
Yeah, and this really comes down to a very personal element in terms of your particular job. So let's just role play through a scenario that you are one of several people doing a similar job with four or five other people in your business, and you want to try and stand out. You want to be the employee who's going to get the next raise, who's going to get the next promotion. And the way you do that on an individual level is you become more productive. You want to be the most productive employee doing what your group is doing because that's going to give you attention. But by being more valuable, is going to generate a lot of benefits to you, but the spillover is it's going to create a lot of value to the firm, the business that you work for, and it's also going to create a lot of value to your customers. So the more value you can bring to the organization, the more value you can bring to the marketplace, then the more valuable you are going to be. And that translates into a higher income. And we always have to remember that it's the value that is being produced, not the simple act of sitting in your cubicle or sitting in your office and doing the job. We need to create value because a market is always made up of two kinds of people, there's a buyer and a seller. So if I'm creating something as a seller, I'm in the business, I'm the employee, I'm offering something, there's got to be somebody out there that's wanting to buy it. Otherwise, I'm not going to have a job at all. And I need to generate income, not just for myself and a paycheck, but also income for my business. And the way I do that is providing something that a consumer is going to willingly pay me money for, because all
Absolutely.
these transactions are voluntary.
Yeah, and that goes back to the previous discussion we had on when you buy. What's the value of selling a good or even a service? Is it's the that value is placed upon what is a willing seller willing to pay for that? What are they willing to pay for that good, that product or service?
That's right. And the point of any production is consumption. It's to sell it. No business makes something for it to just sit around. Everything is made with the sole purpose of being sold.
Right.
So now, when you flip to the consumer side, the only reason we buy things as consumers is because the value that it's going to bring into our lives is greater than the price that we have to pay.
Absolutely.
So if something has a price tag of $10, then worst case scenario, it's going to bring $10 of value into my life and I'm willing to pay 10. But in an ideal situation, it's going to bring more than $10 and then I only have to pay $10. That's the best deal ever, right? When you
Oh
can,
yeah.
get $15 worth of value but only have to pay 10 for it.
Yeah.
So we always have to keep in mind that there's a consumer out there somewhere that we have to cater to. And no consumer goes into the store and says, let me spend $10 and only get $2 worth of value. I mean,
Absolutely.
that would be a very unwise consumer, and very few people are that unwise.
Yeah, it's really neat to think about it, how the system is set up in the United States, in that we everything is motivated towards offering the highest value product at the lowest cost. So
Yes.
so what that does is it drives these businesses. They're not in the business to have employees. That's not the purpose of a business. The purpose of a business is not to employ people, but it's to provide that consumer with the highest value product or service that they want, and to have that consumer deem that as high value, so they get a higher price for it, and then that producer is their objective is to also to keep their cost at the lowest possible amount.
Yes.
It's just awesome how that's set up.
Yeah, and let's be very blunt. I mean, it might sound a little callous to say it this way, but let's be very forthcoming. The employee is the means to the end. So let's just take the example of my employer, Florida State University. Florida State says we want to produce higher education. That's our product, that's our service. And we want to do the best job that we can. We want to produce the highest quality that we can. All right, that's the goal. That's what I'm selling.
Right.
And then they say, well, what do I need in order to do that? I need somebody to come teach economics. And who do I think is qualified to teach economics? And then they go through an interview process. and then they hire somebody like me. But I'm just part of the process. Florida State doesn't say, "Hey, we want to go hire an economist to teach economics." Uh, that's the interim step.
Right.
The final step is the knowledge, the degree that they're trying to do. So the employees, the means to the end, they're part of the process.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's when you look at this, it does sound callous that businesses are not in the business to employ people, but you got to understand that, and you got to know that. I mean, you got to understand what's the driving force for businesses. It's to make a profit. It's to provide a product or service to the consumer that they value, and that they pay more for that service or product than it costs the producer to make it.
Yeah. And then you look at the very simple decisions that any business. So again, let's play out the example with Florida State. If Florida State says, here's my product and here's my service, and I need 5 people to accomplish my goals, well, they're only going to hire 5 people. They're not going to hire 10
Right.
to achieve the same goal. That would just be a waste of money. Why would anybody hire 10 to get the same output when you can only hire 5? So your point is very well made in terms of the goal of the employer is not simply to hire people. Their goal is to have a final product or service that people are going to buy. And they're going to figure out the cheapest way. If you can do that by having your employees work 2 hours a day, you're not going to voluntarily have them work 8 hours a day. That's just a waste of money.
Right. It may make the employee happier because they get paid more money, but in the end, that's a short-term solution or process for that business to operate under.
Yeah, exactly. And that is a perfect transition to item 9 here in our list at 12. Production of goods and services people value, not just jobs, provides the source of higher living standards. And this is something else that sometimes people don't quite realize is, yes, we want everybody who enters the labor force and is searching for a job to find one. That's certainly a desirable goal. Anybody who's willing to work and who has skills, we want them to find a job. But from a more broad perspective, from society's perspective, we want those people producing something of value. So let's just role play a silly example. I could create lots of jobs with a simple law that says no consumer can get out of their car and pump their own gas when they go to the gas station. Now, you and I are old enough to remember as kids that that was the way gas stations operated, but they didn't have to operate that way.
Right.
Today, with all self-service. So let's imagine that was a law. Consumers can't get out of their car, but yet they need gas. So the gas station would have to hire a bunch of people to go out there and put the nozzle in the tank and fill it up. That would create lots of jobs, but would it really create value for our society? And I would say very little value.
Yeah, and it goes
because
back
I'm perfectly content pumping my own gas and doing it at my own convenience instead of waiting for somebody else. So lots of jobs, yes. Lots of value, probably not.
Exactly. So what happens in that situation? So unless that gas pumper is selling some other product when they go out to pump gas, that gas station is going to have to raise the price of the gallon of gas.
Yes, because they're incurring a cost. They have to pay that employee to go out there and put the nozzle in your gas tank, and that costs money. I mean, that may cost $8, $9, $10 an hour, whatever the wage is. And how is the business going to generate enough revenue to pay that person? Well, they're going to have to raise prices. So, am I willing to pay a lot more for a gallon of gas to have somebody else pump it? Well, most people aren't. And we've seen that because that industry has changed such that almost all gas stations are now self-serve.
Yeah, that was, if you talk to some of the kids today, the young people, they won't even remember a time when you had people to go out in a full-service gas station. I mean, that's you never see that.
You see old movies, and sometimes, but really back in the old days, it wasn't just one person; it was a team of people. They come out and they check your air pressure and they check your oil and all the other fluids and
wash your window,
pump your gas. It was almost like pulling into the pits at the Indy 500.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's. Reading this chapter, there's a lot of good information on. You really get into once again government intervention into what businesses do. We've seen examples, and there's examples today where the government pays businesses not to produce what they are in business to produce.
Yeah, some of the most famous examples actually come from the Great Depression era, where we were trying to solve that massive problem, and that was particularly puzzling. We kind of get the sense of why they did it, but when we look back now, we really have to scratch our heads because during the Great Depression, you had so many people who were not only unemployed, but they didn't have enough to eat.
Mm.
We've all seen pictures and images of the bread lines in the soup kitchens, and yet at the same time, our federal government was either directly paying farmers not to produce crops or telling them to destroy items.
Right.
So, the classic example is potato farmers were instructed to inject their potatoes with a purple dye. Now, that wasn't dangerous, it wasn't poisonous or anything, but it certainly made it inedible.
Right.
So, you've got people who are standing in line because they don't have enough to eat, and at the same time, we are destroying crops. Farmers are being paid not to grow crops. They just let their farms idle. And they destroyed millions of pigs because the idea was that if we restrict output, that's going to raise prices.
Right.
So that was a noble intent. We wanted to raise prices because they had fallen so much during the Depression. But at the same time, it just really didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And there's been countless examples over the years since the Great Depression of the federal government asking or paying businesses not to do something productive for the sake of raising prices, and we've destroyed valuable resources, or we've just not let valuable resources be used in the manner in which they should have been used.
Exactly. I don't remember the Great Depression and the potato deal. I'm not quite that old, but I do remember in 2009, and the book points it out, the cash for clunkers. That was I think a
Yes.
controversial policy that the federal government enacted, and it was it really had probably unintended consequences to the economy.
Yeah, and the important thing to keep in mind with these policies is they are typically very well intended. I mean, the people who are passing these laws do not have evil intentions that they're trying to make things worse.
Agree.
But when they don't fully understand the economics, they don't understand the consequences. So the cash for clunkers was very well intended. So in 2009, did we want to help the auto industry and their employees? Absolutely. So great intentions. But really, what happened is all we did was move a little bit of sales around in time. And a friend of mine is a perfect example of this, where he said, you know what, I was going to buy a new truck in a couple of years, but they just made it so advantageous that I decided to go ahead and buy one now as a result of this cash for clunker detail. So yes, we had more production now versus later, but in total, the production didn't go up.
Right.
And that's really the unintended consequences. That all we did was move it around maybe 2 years earlier than what it would have happened anyways, but we didn't magically create a whole bunch of new production and a new sales. And really, when you factor in all the benefits and all of the costs, it turned out to be, at best, a very small benefit to our economy. And a more likely scenario is it created more harm than good. That is, the costs outweighed the benefits. So good intentions, but many times not very good outcomes.
Yeah, and then when you factor in who it could have harmed in that situation, what you did was you made there were less used cars available in the market, so that punished the lower economic group of people. So those people that needed used cars cheaper, they just weren't, fewer were available, which drove the price of those available up.
Yes, and that was really the most damaging impact. So under normal circumstances, when you go to buy a new car, you trade in your old car, and that old car goes into the used car market, and somebody else is allowed to buy it. Well, under the Cash for Clunkers program, when you traded in your old car, everything had to be destroyed. I mean, they couldn't even sell it for parts.
Right.
So the aftermarket for parts was damaged. the market for used cars was damaged. And who typically enters those markets? People at the lower income distribution end of the spectrum. So you wound up helping relatively rich people who could afford new cars, and you wound up hurting people relatively poor who then had higher prices for parts and for used cars. So who benefited? Relatively wealthy people. Who was harmed? Relatively poor people. That wasn't the intent for sure,
Right.
but that was the consequence of this program.
Yeah. Another one of those unintended consequences when the government weighs into just normal market cycles. I don't want to close this out without bringing the example in the book about the digging ditches with shovels or big heavy equipment versus spoons. So I'll let you go through that, but I thought that was really kind of brought it all into focus and really gets back to your point of you don't have a business to create jobs. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to create value to the consumers that's going to purchase those goods or services.
Yeah, the purpose is to get the job done.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Joseph Calhoun, economic professor at FSU. Thank you for that great discussion again today on economics and economic theory. One thing I'd like to close this with, and I want to quote this out of the book, so I don't want to miss this. So there's supposedly an engineer visiting China. He came across a large crew of men building a dam with picks and shovels. When the engineer pointed out to the supervisor that the job could be completed in a few days rather than many months if the men were given motorized earth-moving equipment, the supervisor said, "Such equipment would destroy many jobs." "Oh," the engineer responded, "I thought you were interested in building a dam. If it's more jobs you want, why don't you have the men use spoons instead of shovels?" So I think that kind of brings, that illustration really brings that point home, that our economy is about providing value to the end user, the customers. They put a price on it, and it's the price, the willingness of the buyer to purchase the goods from the seller. So it's all about creating value that drives the economy. It's not about businesses creating jobs for the sake of jobs. So we've had a couple of illustrations of that, or actually many illustrations of that. So hopefully that point will be really focused, and that'll really give you a good idea of another economic theory that our economy works on. So with that, I want to close this out and want to say thank you, audience, for joining us for another show. If you're watching it on YouTube, please be sure and leave us comments and notes inside the box there, and I will get back to those notes and comments that you leave. So leave us something there in YouTube. Subscribe to our show. Check us out on all the podcast channels that you're used to. We're out there, so check us out, Answers That Count, and also check us out on our website, answersthatcount.com. Send me a note on that if you'd like. Send me an email, cmusgrove@answersthatcount.com. I'll get back to you if you've got an idea. If you've got a question, just let me know. Thank you again for joining us for another exciting episode of Answers That Count. Join us every week. Check us out on all those channels, including YouTube. Have a great day. Have a great week. Peace.